The wind in the Wyoming territory did not blow so much as it scraped. It took the topsoil and the loose ambitions of men and carried them eastward, leaving only the hardpan and the stubborn behind. It was the autumn of the year 1886, and the Harlan Creek Ranch sat in the shadow of the jagged foothills, a solitary collection of weathered timber and faded paint that looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself rather than being built upon it. The sky above was a vast, unforgiving gray, heavy with the promise of early snow. The air smelled of dried sage, wood smoke, and the damp, metallic scent of impending winter. It was a hard country. A country that demanded everything a person had and rarely offered a word of thanks in return. Eli Croft knew the demands of the land better than most. He was 35 years old, a man carved from the very elements that sought to wear him down. For 2 decades, he had been a ghost moving across the western expanse. He had drifted through the mining camps of Colorado, the sprawling cattle drives of Texas, and the timber stands of Oregon. He had never stayed anywhere past a single season. The rhythm of his life was dictated by the packing of saddlebags and the tying of bedrolls. He was a man who belonged to the road going out into the dark beyond it. He was quiet, steady, and entirely untethered. He carried his silence, not as a weapon, but as a shield against a world that was too loud, too fast, and too full of temporary attachments. He was a ranch hand, a laborer, a man who traded the strength of his back for a warm meal and a place in the hayloft. He had arrived at the Harlan Creek Ranch 3 years ago, riding a tired roan gelding, expecting nothing more than a few months of wages before the frost drove him further south. He had not expected Clara Harlan. She was the matriarch of the ranch, a widow with eyes like chipped flint and a spine made of iron. She had looked at Eli when he rode into the yard, taking the measure of him in a single, sweeping glance. She had seen the weariness in his shoulders, the careful way he handled his horse, and the quiet competence in his hands. She had hired him on the spot. For a year, Eli had worked under her sharp, uncompromising direction. He had mended fences, broken horses, and pulled calves from the frozen spring mud. He had expected to leave when the leaves turned, just as he always did. But then the fever came. It swept through the valley like a wildfire, indiscriminate and cruel. Clara Harlan, who had seemed as indestructible as the mountains themselves, was struck down in the span of a week. The death of Clara Harlan was a quiet, devastating thing. The house, usually filled with the sound of her practical, commanding voice, descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, under a sky that wept a cold, steady rain. The mud clung to the boots of the mourners, a physical weight that mirrored the grief in their chests. Eli stood at the back of the small gathering in the Crestfall Cemetery, the rain running down the brim of his hat, watching the pine box being lowered into the earth. He watched the townspeople, the neighboring ranchers, and the solemn face of the preacher. But mostly, he watched Nora. Nora Harlan was Clara's daughter. She was 28 years old, a woman who possessed her mother's resilience, but tempered it with a quiet, observant kindness. She stood by the open grave, her posture rigid, her face pale against the dark wool of her mourning dress. She did not weep. She endured. Eli watched the way she held herself together, the way she absorbed the condolences of the townspeople with polite, hollow nods. He saw the sheer, terrifying weight of the world descending upon her narrow shoulders. When the service was over, they rode back to the ranch in silence. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the canvas of the wagon. Eli had planned to pack his gear that evening. His season was over. The matriarch was gone. It was time for the drifter to drift. That evening, the storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and howling down the stone chimney. Eli sat in the bunkhouse, his saddlebags laid out on the narrow cot. He was folding his spare shirt when he heard the heavy wooden door of the main house open and close. A moment later, a lantern light bobbed across the muddy yard. It was Nora. She stepped into the bunkhouse, the wind whipping her damp hair across her face. She carried a thick, leather-bound book in her hands. It was the ranch ledger. She did not look at him at first. She walked to the small wooden table, set the lantern down, and placed the ledger beside it. She opened the book, her fingers trembling slightly, and turned the pages until she found what she was looking for. "I did not know," she said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the small room, cutting through the sound of the wind. Eli stopped folding his shirt. He looked at her. He waited. "The debt," she said. She traced a line of ink on the page. "My mother." She hid it well. 3 bad winters in a row. The bank in Cheyenne. The suppliers in Crestfall. It is all here. She looked up at him then, her eyes dark and wide with a fear she was trying desperately to conceal. "I own the dirt, Mr. Croft, but I owe for everything that stands upon it." Eli looked at the ledger. He looked at the numbers written in Clara's sharp, precise hand. He saw the ruin laid out in black ink. He looked back at Nora. She was standing there, utterly alone in the world, facing a mountain of obligation that would have broken men twice her size. She was not asking for his help. She was simply stating a fact. She was a woman who dealt in realities, no matter how harsh they were. He looked at his saddlebags on the bed. He looked at the worn leather, the brass buckles, the sum total of his wandering life. He thought of the road south, the empty plains, the next town, the next temporary bunkhouse. He thought of the silence of the trail. And then he looked at the way Nora's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her jaw set. A pause. He walked over to the cot. He picked up his spare shirt, shook it out, and hung it back on the peg on the wall. He picked up the saddlebags and tossed them into the corner of the room. He turned back to her. "The roan has a slight limp in the left foreleg," he said. "I will need to poultice it in the morning. And the west fence line down by the creek is washing out. We should haul some stone there before the ground freezes solid." Nora stared at him. The breath caught in her throat. She looked at the empty cot, the saddlebags in the corner, and then back to his steady, unreadable face. She understood. He was not leaving. He was stepping into the yoke beside her. She nodded, a single, sharp movement. "Tomorrow, then?" she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of a quiet, relentless partnership that defied the understanding of anyone who looked too closely. They did not speak of his decision to stay. They did not speak of the debt, other than the practical discussions of which calves to sell and which repairs could wait another season. They simply worked. They worked from the gray light of dawn until the stars burned cold and bright in the black sky. They fought the land, they fought the weather, and slowly, agonizingly, they began to push back the tide of red ink in the ledger. Their life became a study in silent observation and unspoken care. Eli learned the rhythms of Nora's days. He knew the precise moment she would appear on the back porch with a bucket of feed for the chickens. He knew the way she hummed a tuneless, breathy melody when she was kneading bread dough in the kitchen. He knew the heavy, exhausted sigh she gave when she finally sat down at the end of the day, rubbing the small of her back. He watched her from a distance, across the yard, across the pasture, across the dinner table. He saw the strength in her, the unyielding core that kept the ranch alive. He saw the way the wind whipped color into her cheeks during the winter feeds. He saw the way she gentled a frightened colt with nothing more than a soft voice and a steady hand. Nora, in turn, learned the topography of Eli's silences. She learned that his quiet was not empty, but full of thought and observation. She noticed the small, unseen things he did. The way the hinges on the heavy barn doors never squeaked because he oiled them before she ever had to ask. The way the firewood was always chopped and stacked precisely the way she liked it, the pieces small enough for the kitchen stove. The way he always made sure her riding saddle was clean and the leather softened with oil after a long day in the rain. She noticed the way he held his coffee cup with both hands on freezing mornings, the steam rising around his weathered face. She noticed the steady, reliable rhythm of his bootsteps on the porch, a sound that had become the anchor of her world. They communicated in a language of practicalities and shared labor. Their intimacy was forged in the mud of the calving pens and the heat of the hayfields. "You set those posts too shallow," she told him one afternoon in late spring, standing by the wagon as he tamped dirt around a fresh cedar post. He leaned on the heavy iron bar, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his canvas glove. He looked at the post, then at her. "They are 3 feet down. The frost will not heave them. The frost will heave a boulder in this valley, and you know it. They need to be deeper. The cattle will push right through. The cattle are not going to push through 3 strands of barbed wire and a solid cedar post unless they suddenly grow wings and decide to fly. I am telling you, it is too shallow." He looked at her. A faint, almost imperceptible amusement touched the corners of his eyes. "I will dig the next one to China, if it pleases you." She kept her face stern, though the edges of her mouth betrayed a slight softening. "Just dig it deeper. I do not want to be chasing strays in a blizzard because you were lazy with the iron bar." "Lazy," he repeated, shaking his head slowly. He lifted the heavy bar and brought it down into the earth with a solid, echoing thud. "Yes, ma'am." It was banter. It was a witty argument over trivial matters that served as a safe, structured way to interact, a demonstration of mutual intellectual respect. It was the closest they came to flirtation. The town of Crestfall watched this dynamic with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. When they rode into town together in the wagon to buy supplies, the collective gaze of the community followed them. Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the general store, was a man who made a living on observation. He stood behind his polished oak counter, weighing out flour and sugar, watching the way Eli and Nora moved around each other. They never touched. They rarely even looked directly at one another for more than a passing second. But they moved in perfect, unconscious synchronization. If Nora moved to examine a bolt of cloth, Eli naturally shifted to give her room, his eyes scanning the shelves for the hardware they needed. When it was time to pay, Eli would pull the small leather coin purse from his pocket, but he would hand it to Nora to count out the coins. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement that she was the owner, the decision-maker. "You two are a puzzle," Mr. Abernathy said one afternoon, leaning across the counter as Nora counted out the silver for a tin of coffee. Nora paused, looking up. "How is that, Mr. Abernathy?" The store owner wiped a floury hand on his apron. "Town looks out for you, Nora. You know that. We all respected your mother. We respect you. But watching the two of you is like watching 2 mules pull a wagon while refusing to admit they are in the same harness." Eli, standing near the door with a sack of salt on his shoulder, shifted his weight. "We manage fine." Abernathy chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. "Oh, you manage. You have a remarkable inability to see what is standing right in front of you, Eli Croft. Both of you. It is a dangerous pastime, pretending the world is only made of dirt and ledgers." Nora finished counting the coins, sliding them across the glass. She did not blush. She did not look at Eli. She kept her composure perfectly intact. "We will take a tin of those peppermint drops as well, please. The ones in the glass jar." Abernathy sighed, shaking his head as he reached for the jar. "Stubborn, the both of you. Before we go further into the wind of the Wyoming territory, I want to ask you a question. What country are you listening from? I know we have folks tuning in from all over the world, and I always love seeing where this community reaches. Drop it in the comments below. Now, let us get back to the ridge and back to the silence of the Harlan Creek Ranch. The silence between them was not always comfortable. As the 3rd year drew to a close, the unspoken feelings began to press against the boundaries they had so carefully constructed. Eli found himself waking in the dark hours of the early morning, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of the bunkhouse, his chest tight with a longing he refused to name. He wanted her. He wanted the steady, quiet strength of her. He wanted to sit on the porch in the evening and hold her hand without the pretense of discussing the cattle. But he was a ranch hand, a drifter with 20 years of dust on his boots and nothing to his name but a horse and a saddle. She was the owner of the ranch. She was educated, capable, and deserving of a man who could offer her security, not just calluses and sweat. He believed, with the rigid, honorable logic of a man who had nothing, that his love for her meant he must never speak of it. To speak of it would be to burden her, to force her to reject him, or worse, to accept him out of some misplaced sense of gratitude for his labor. Nora, too, suffered in the silence. She mended his shirts, her fingers tracing the worn fabric across the shoulders, imagining the heat of his skin beneath it. She left covered plates of warm food on the stove for him when he was out late pulling a calf, an unspoken gesture of care that she hoped conveyed what her words could not. She waited. She was the patient anchor, holding her ground, hoping that one day the steady, honorable man sleeping in her bunkhouse would wake up and see that the home he had been looking for his entire life was already built around him. But she was terrified. She had lost her father when she was a child. She had lost her mother. The thought of losing Eli, of pushing him away by demanding more than he was willing to give, was a paralyzing fear. And so, the stalemate continued, until the dust appeared on the horizon. It was a Tuesday in late October. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Eli was in the upper pasture, repairing a section of rail fence, when he saw the carriage turning off the main road onto the long dirt track leading to the ranch house. It was not a local wagon. It was a fine, black lacquered carriage drawn by a matched pair of bays. Eli set down his hammer. He wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. He watched the carriage roll into the yard. The man who stepped down was Silas Vance. He was a wealthy cattleman from over the ridge near Cheyenne, a man whose reputation for ruthless expansion was matched only by his polished, respectable demeanor. He wore a fine wool coat, clean leather boots, and a silver watch chain that gleamed dully in the gray light. He was the respectable obstacle, the catalyst. Eli walked slowly down from the pasture, his tools heavy in his hands. He did not go to the porch. He went to the barn, stepping into the dim, familiar shadows smelling of sweet hay and old liniment. He stood just inside the open double doors, out of sight, watching the scene unfold on the porch of the main house. Nora had come out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood at the top of the steps, looking down at Vance. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. "This is a long ride for a social call." Vance removed his hat. His hair was perfectly combed. He smiled, a polite, measured expression. "Miss Harlan, it is a pleasure to see you looking so well. I will be brief, as I know you are a busy woman. I was recently in Crestfall. I had a conversation with the bank manager." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The bank. The debt. "Did you?" Nora said. Her voice was flat, revealing nothing. "I did," Vance continued, stepping closer to the base of the stairs. "I am aware of the financial difficulties the Harlan Creek Ranch has faced since your mother's passing. It is a heavy burden for a woman to carry alone. I am not alone, Mr. Vance. I have good help. Help is one thing. Ownership, security, that is another," Vance said smoothly. "I am expanding my operations. This valley is prime grazing land. I am prepared to purchase the entirety of your debt from the bank in Crestfall. I will clear the ledger completely." A heavy silence fell over the yard. Eli stopped breathing. He gripped the handle of his hammer until his knuckles ached. He knew what was coming. The entire valley knew Silas Vance had been looking for a wife to manage his large estate in Cheyenne. And in return? Nora asked. In return, we merge our interests, Vance said, his tone softening into something resembling courtship. You would no longer have to worry about winter freezes ruining you. You would no longer have to mend your own fences or wear yourself down to the bone. You would have the life a woman of your standing deserves. As my wife. Eli closed his eyes. The words hit him like a physical blow. It was the brutal, unvarnished truth of the world. Vance could offer her salvation. Vance could erase the red ink with a single stroke of a pen. Vance could give her safety, comfort, and respectability. What could Eli offer? A repaired latch, a chopped cord of wood, a lifetime of calluses. Nora stood perfectly still on the porch. She looked at Vance. She looked out at the rolling gray hills. And then, for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicked toward the dark, open doors of the barn. She could not see him in the shadows, but she knew he was there. She always knew where he was. That is a very generous offer, Mr. Vance, Nora said slowly, carefully. And a very permanent one. I will need time to consider it. Vance smiled, clearly pleased. He put his hat back on. Of course. A decision of this magnitude requires thought. I will be staying at the hotel in Crestfall for the rest of the week. You may send word to me there. He bowed slightly, climbed back into his fine carriage, and drove away, leaving a plume of dust hanging in the cold air. Nora stood on the porch long after the carriage disappeared. She did not move. Eli stood in the barn, his chest tight with a sudden suffocating panic. The comfortable stasis was shattered. The unspoken rules of their existence had been torn apart. That night the temperature dropped sharply. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the tin roof of the bunkhouse. Eli did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his narrow cot in the dark, his hands resting on his knees. He thought about the 3 years. He thought about the way she looked when she was tired, the soot on her cheek from the stove, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes when they argued about the cattle. He loved her. He loved her with a quiet, desperate intensity that terrified him. But love, he told himself, was not enough. Love did not pay the bank. Love did not stop the winter winds. Love was a luxury for men who owned fine carriages and silver watch chains. If he stayed, his presence would only complicate her decision. If he stayed, she might refuse Vance out of some misplaced loyalty to the partnership they had built, thereby condemning herself to a life of debt and grueling labor. He was the obstacle to her salvation. The realization settled over him with a cold, heavy finality. The kindest thing he could do, the most honorable thing he could do, was to remove himself from the equation, to make the choice easy for her. He stood up. He pulled his saddlebags from beneath the cot. He packed slowly, deliberately in the dark. He packed his spare shirts, his straight razor, his tin cup. He left behind the heavy winter coat she had mended for him. He left behind the new leather gloves she had bought him in town last Christmas. He took only what he had brought with him 3 years ago. The room felt empty, stripped of the life he had briefly allowed himself to believe was his. He waited until the hour just before dawn. The world was pitched in absolute blackness, the air bitterly cold. He carried his saddlebags out of the bunkhouse, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the frosted earth. He walked to the barn, saddled the roan gelding in the dark, relying on touch and memory. The horse shifted uneasily, sensing the disruption in the routine. "Easy," Eli whispered, patting the horse's warm neck. "We are moving on." He led the horse out of the barn. The eastern horizon was just beginning to bleed a pale, bruised purple. The wind bit through his canvas jacket. He walked toward the main gate, intending to ride out without a word, to spare them both the agony of a goodbye. He was halfway across the yard when he saw her. Nora was standing by the main gate. She wore her heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. She had been waiting for him. Eli stopped. The roan snorted, tossing its head. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, filled with the sound of the wind and the creak of the saddle leather. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. She just looked at him. Eli swallowed hard. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "I am leaving," he said. "I can see that," Nora replied. Her voice was remarkably steady, though her hands were clenched tightly in the folds of her shawl. "It is for the best," he said, forcing himself to look at her face. "Vance is a good man. He can give you what you need. He can save the ranch. You will not have to worry anymore." "Do not tell me what I need, Eli Croft," she said, her voice dropping lower, vibrating with a sudden, fierce anger. "And do not pretend you are doing this for me. You are doing this because it is easier to run away than to stand here and face what is real." He flinched. The words struck true, piercing the armor of his honorable intentions. "I have nothing to offer you, Nora. Nothing but dirt and hard work. You deserve better. I deserve a say in my own life." She snapped, taking a step toward him. "I deserve a partner who does not pack his bags in the middle of the night like a thief." She reached into the deep pocket of her dress and pulled out an envelope. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn smooth from being handled countless times. She held it out to him. Her hand was shaking. "What is this?" he asked, not taking it. "Then I cannot keep this from you anymore," she sighed, the anger draining from her, leaving only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I was a coward. I kept it because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I gave it to you, and you read it, and you still packed your saddlebags and left, then I would know for certain. I would know it was me you did not want." Eli stared at the envelope. He slowly reached out and took it. He recognized the heavy, cream-colored paper. He recognized the sharp, precise handwriting on the front. It was addressed to him. E. Croft. "My mother wrote that 3 weeks before she died," Nora said, her voice breaking slightly. "She told me to give it to you when the time was right. I have carried it every day since." Eli opened the envelope. The paper felt fragile in his thick, calloused fingers. He unfolded the letter in the dim, gray light of the dawn. "Mr. Croft," the letter began, "I am an old woman, and I do not have time for foolishness. I am dying. Do not act surprised. We both know it. I am leaving the ranch to Nora. I am also leaving her a substantial debt. It is a terrible burden for a mother to place on a daughter, but it is the reality of the ledger. She will need help. She will need a partner, not a hired hand. A partner. I have watched you this past year. You are a quiet man, but you are not a blind one. You see her. You see the strength in her. And I see the way she watches you when you are not looking. You are two stubborn fools who would rather break your backs mending a fence than speak a word of truth to one another. I am formally naming you a full partner in the Harlan Creek Ranch, effective upon my passing. The legal papers are with the lawyer in Crestfall. Stay with her, Eli. She is the best thing that will ever happen to a drifter like you. Do not let your pride ruin her life. Yours, Clara Harlan." Eli read the words twice. The letters blurred together. The wind seemed to stop howling. The cold vanished. He looked at the paper, seeing the sharp, uncompromising will of Clara Harlan reaching out from the grave, shattering his excuses, tearing down the walls he had built around himself. She had seen it. The old woman had seen it all. She had given him the one thing he believed he could never have, the right to stand beside her daughter as an equal. He looked up at Nora. She was watching him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, her face pale and terrified in the dawn light. She had risked everything by giving him this letter. She had laid her heart bare on the frozen ground. The catalyst had done its work. The steady homesteader was finally awake. Eli looked at the letter in his hand. He folded it carefully and placed it in his inner coat pocket, right over his heart. He looked at the roan gelding, saddled and ready for the long road south. He looked at the heavy leather saddlebags, packed with the meager belongings of a 20-year drift. He reached out. He unbuckled the saddlebags. He let them drop to the dirt with a heavy, final thud. He stepped away from the horse. He walked toward Nora, closing the distance between them until he was standing right in front of her. He looked down into her eyes, seeing the fear slowly giving way to a fragile, desperate hope. Grand romantic gestures were for poetry books and fine carriages. Eli Croft was a man of the dirt, a man of practicalities, a man who spoke only when the words were absolutely necessary. "I have been a fool," he said. His voice was low, rough with emotion. "I have been slow. I thought I was doing the honorable thing. I thought I was protecting you." "I do not need protecting, Eli," she said softly. "I know," he said. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently touching the side of her face, tracing the line of her jaw. It was the first time he had ever touched her with bare hands. Her skin was freezing, but it burned against his fingertips. "I am not leaving, Nora. I am never leaving. I would like to stay. As your partner, as your husband, if you will have me." Nora closed her eyes, leaning her face into the warmth of his rough hand. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. She let out a long, shuddering breath, releasing 3 years of waiting, 3 years of fear, 3 years of silent endurance. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. A small, brilliant smile broke across her face, lighting up the gray morning. "It took you long enough," she whispered. "I got there," he said. "Yes," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in the worn canvas of his coat. "Obviously, yes." They stood there in the freezing dawn, holding each other in the dirt of the ranch yard, the dropped saddlebags forgotten at their feet. The wind picked up again, howling down from the ridge, but neither of them felt the cold. The debt remained in the ledger. The winter was still coming. The work would still be brutal, but the silence was broken. The long drift was over. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Crestfall. It was a simple affair, held in the small wooden church at the end of the main street. The sky was clear, the air biting cold, the ground hard with the first deep freeze of the season. Nora wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, her mother's silver locket resting against her collarbone. Eli wore a new suit, purchased from Mr. Abernathy's store, though he still looked as though he would be more comfortable in canvas and leather. The town turned out in force. The community, acting as a collective witness, filled the pews, their presence a validation of the bond they had all seen growing for years. Mr. Abernathy sat in the front row, nodding with quiet satisfaction. Silas Vance did not attend, having returned to Cheyenne shortly after receiving a brief, polite, and terribly final letter from Nora. The ceremony was short. The vows were spoken clearly, without hesitation. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Eli did not sweep her into a dramatic embrace. He simply took her hand, his large, rough fingers interlocking with hers, and held it tightly. It was a gesture of absolute, unbreakable solidity. It was a promise forged in iron and dirt. 10 years later, the wind still scraped across the Wyoming territory. The Harlan Creek Ranch still sat in the shadow of the jagged foothills, but it looked different now. The timber was freshly painted. The fences were strong and straight, the cedar posts sunk deep into the earth. The debt to the bank in Crestfall had been paid in full 5 years ago, the final line in Clara's ledger crossed out with a thick stroke of black ink. The ranch was thriving. It was a summer evening. The heat of the day had finally broken, leaving behind a warm, golden twilight that bathed the valley in soft light. Eli sat on the front porch, leaning back in a wooden rocking chair. His hair was heavily salted with gray, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by a decade of sun and wind. But he looked settled. He looked like a man who knew exactly where he belonged. Nora came out through the screen door, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him and sat in the chair beside his. She looked older, too, but the fierce, resilient light in her eyes remained undimmed. Down in the yard, a young boy of 8 was clumsily trying to swing a rope over a wooden fence post, mimicking the ranch hands. A younger girl, perhaps 5, was sitting in the dirt, meticulously building a small corral out of twigs. They possessed their mother's dark hair and their father's quiet, observant demeanor. Eli took a sip of his coffee. He watched his son finally manage to loop the rope over the post. The boy let out a triumphant yell. He drops his elbow too much when he throws, Eli noted quietly. Nora smiled, taking a sip from her own mug. He is 8, Eli. Give him time. He is a bit slow to learn the roping. Eli looked at her, catching the subtle, teasing lilt in her voice. He raised an eyebrow. Slow, is he? Well, Nora said, her eyes twinkling with dry amusement as she looked out over the valley. He comes by it honestly. I once knew a man who took 3 years to figure out how to unpack a pair of saddlebags. Eli chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound in his chest. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His thumb traced the smooth, worn gold band on her finger. I got there eventually. Yes, Nora said softly, her fingers tightening around his. You did. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. They did not need words to fill the quiet anymore. The quiet was no longer a wall between them. It was a shared space, a sanctuary built on trust, respect, and a love that had weathered the harshest storms the territory could throw at them. That is the thing about a slow-burning fire. It does not flash and blind you with sudden explosive heat. It takes time to catch. It requires patience, careful tending, and the willingness to endure the cold while the embers build. But once it takes hold in the deep, solid wood, it burns hotter and lasts longer than any quick spark ever could. It provides the kind of warmth that can sustain a life, a warmth that endures through the bitterest winters and the darkest nights. It is the quiet courage to stay, to build, and to finally speak the truth when the moment demands it. Thank you for riding with me today. I am grateful you were here to share in the silence and the strength of the Harlan Creek Ranch. Until next time, keep riding.